It was a quiet evening, just a few days before Christmas. I was alone in my flat, enjoying my first evening of Christmas leave with my dog, Max, who was curled up at the foot of my couch. The weather was really nasty outside, and the flat that I was in at the time was a corner unit, so whenever the wind blew particularly hard, it created this cartoonish howling sound which, if you were nice and warm inside, was actually quite comforting. It was about 6 o'clock, and I was on my couch under a pile of blankets, sipping a cup of coffee, when I heard a knock at my door. It wasn't a loud knock, but it was sudden enough to startle me. It wasn't often that anyone knocked on my door because we had an intercom system for the building. If someone was knocking, it was most probably one of my neighbors. I didn't hesitate to get up and walk down the corridor towards the front door, but out of curiosity, I had looked through the peephole so I could see who it was. And there was a man, dressed as Father Christmas, with a clipboard in one hand and one of those plastic charity collection cups in the other. You know, the kind with just a little slot in the top to put money in. He was wearing the whole Santa Claus getup, hat and fake silvery beard included, so I couldn't see exactly who was underneath it. But the clipboard and collection cup had me assuming that it was one of my neighbors collecting for charity. I cracked the door open just a sliver, keeping the chain lock in place, and then said, "Hi there," in the assumption that he was about to explain what charity he was collecting for, etc. But after taking an instant-looking step towards the door and raising the collection cup, the man lunged at the door and pressed his weight against it in an attempt to force it open. His eyes were the only part of him that I could really see, but the way they changed in that moment was absolutely terrifying. They were so wide, and his face turned so red. But as he pushed, the door chain caught with a loud metal snap. It was holding, but just barely, and I remember how panic rose up in me as he continued to push. The door rattled on its hinges as the man shoved even harder, growling sometimes under his breath as he forced his hand through the gap, his fingers clawing at the chain. Everything happened in a blur. I tried to push the door shut, but he was too strong, and when the chain suddenly snapped, the door flew open, and he was inside. As he came towards me, the smell of alcohol hit me like a wave. I screamed, backing away as fast as I could, but the apartment was small. There was nowhere to run. My back hit the wall and he was on me, his breath hot and rancid as his hands grabbed my arms, and he used his weight to pin me in place. Then I heard the low, guttural growl, cutting through the chaos like some blade, and in the corner of my vision, I saw Max leap up off the couch, his hackles raised and teeth bared. And I'd never seen him like that before. He'd always been such a sweet, gentle dog with people and other animals, but that night, he was transformed into a furious, snarling beast. Max launched himself at the man and bit the arm that he was using to hold me. The man screamed and then loosened his grip as he tried to shake Max off. I remember seeing skin and blood under his torn red suit as Max held on, growling loudly the whole time. The man stumbled back, hammering his other fist against the top of Max's head, but he was relentless. He bit and clawed, his sheer determination driving the man further away from me, giving me time to scramble to my feet. My legs trembled so badly that I could barely stand, but adrenaline pushed me to grab the first thing I could reach, which happened to be a very heavy wooden Buddha statue from the shelf. I hurled it at the man, point blank too, and it hit him so hard in the face that it split his forehead open. He shouted something terrible, staggering backwards while bringing up a hand to his face. Max let go of his arm, but then chased him all the way down the corridor, snapping at his legs as he staggered back towards the open doorway, with blood streaming down his face and onto that fake silvery white beard. He stumbled out of my flat, but Max stopped at the threshold to bark ferociously at him as the man disappeared down the stairs. No one came out of their flats to help me. Most had gone home to see family elsewhere, I think, and anyone in those flats either didn't hear the commotion or just pretended not to. For a moment after I pulled Max in and closed the door, there was silence except for Max's ragged breathing. I managed to walk back into my living room, and then I sat down on the couch again, trembling and in a state of disbelief. It all happened so suddenly, and it had ended just as quickly. I think that it must have been no more than 2 minutes from the knock on my door to me sitting back down on my couch again. It was all surreal. Max trotted over to me, his tail wagging slightly as he looked up at me with this sort of "I did a good job" look. And I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his fur, and I started to cry. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to call the police. They arrived quickly, and I explained everything, and they examined the scene before taking a few photos of the broken door chain. They were both very nice, and as one of the officers knelt down to pet Max, he said, "This one's a little hero, isn't he?" And I couldn't have agreed more. If it hadn't been for him, I don't know what would have happened, and thinking about it makes my stomach churn. The man in the Santa suit was caught not far away, still bleeding from the bites my dog had given him. The police later told me that he had a criminal record, a very long one, which honestly didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me was how brazen he'd been about it, how he'd just knocked on someone's door, almost at random. But it wasn't at random, not according to the police. It couldn't have been. And what they told me would come to haunt me for a very long, long time. And that night in bed, as I laid there with Max curled up beside me, I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt too quiet, too dark, and every little noise made my heart race. But whenever the fear threatened to overwhelm me, I reached out and rested my hand on Max's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. He was my protector, my best friend, and I never felt so fortunate to have him in my life. Christmas came and went, but the break-in had a way of overshadowing things. I asked my mom not to tell anyone about it over Christmas dinner because it was a chance for me to try and forget about it, even if it was just for an afternoon. But even then, it was still there in the background. I felt a lot less safe back in my flat, and any safety that I felt before felt like a silly little illusion, but I also felt a deep sense of gratitude. I was okay. Max had saved me, and that was all that mattered. From that day onward, I never took his loyalty for granted. I gave him extra treats, took him on extra long walks, and gave him all the love I could possibly give. He had been there for me when I needed him most, and I would spend the rest of my life repaying that debt. It was the day before Christmas, and the store was chaotic with last-minute shoppers. Parents rushed through the aisles, pushing carts piled high with wrapping paper, decorations, and toys, and the shelves were almost bare with only a few items left that looked like decent gifts, and people seemed frantic, grabbing whatever they could find. I was in the toy section trying to find something for my niece, and it was very slim pickings. Then I noticed a toy on the shelf that seemed to be the hot item. It was brightly colored and packaged to grab attention, and there was only a couple left, and I saw two parents reach for the same one at the exact same time. One was a man and the other was a woman, and they both grabbed it and wouldn't let go. They started arguing right away. The voices were sharp and loud, cutting through the noise of the store. Other shoppers began to notice and stopped to watch. Neither of them would back down. The man pulled on the toy, but the woman held on tightly, and they were glaring at each other, and their faces were just red with frustration, and it was clear that neither was going to give up. The tension grew as they continued to fight over this toy. The man shoved the woman, and she stumbled, but didn't seem to fall, and she came right back at him, reaching for the toy again. And that's when it escalated. The man leaned in and bit her arm, hard. She screamed, and I saw blood starting to rush down her arm from where his teeth had broken the skin. People nearby gasped and backed away. Some tried to step in, but the man was still holding onto the toy, his grip seemingly unrelenting, and the woman clutched her arm, wincing in pain, but she didn't let go of the toy either. Store employees came running, and somewhere in the background I could hear the faint sound of sirens getting closer. And eventually the man dropped the toy onto the floor. He looked around. His chest was just heaving as he tried to catch his breath. and then he turned and started walking away, like nothing had happened at all. The woman was still holding her arm, and she bent down and picked up the toy, and she seemed to clung to it like it was the most important thing in the world. The police arrived shortly after, and they spoke to both of those people, and the man was taken away. The woman was given first aid for the bite, and she looked shaken and pale but refused to let go of that toy. The crowd that gathered slowly dispersed, and the store fell quiet again. People whispered as they walked away, avoiding that section of the store, and I left the store without buying anything. My hands were empty, but my mind was full of many questions. How could something like that, like a toy, lead to such violence? And as I walked to my car, I kept thinking about the child who would receive that toy. Would they ever even really know what their mom went through to get it? I hoped they wouldn't, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the whole scene had left behind. Christmas Eve was cold. I was walking through the streets carrying a bag of gifts, and the sidewalks were busy and there were lights and decorations everywhere. I saw a man sitting on the curb near an empty lot, and his coat was very old and torn. He had a long beard and wore a beanie, and I thought he was homeless and needed help. I felt bad for him. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. I walked over and held it out to him, and he looked at me, but his eyes didn't seem thankful. He didn't look happy at all, he just sort of stared. I thought he was surprised, so I leaned down and put the money in his hand, and as soon as I did, he stood up very quickly. He was bigger than I expected, and he moved fast. I stepped back, but he grabbed my coat and pushed me down. My back hit the ground and I couldn't get up, and he started hitting me. His fist came down hard and I tried to cover my face, but it didn't help. My head was spinning and everything hurt, and I could hear people walking by, but no one stopped. I couldn't call for help. After a while, he stopped and he stood over me, breathing heavily, and he bent down, picked up the $20 and put it in his pocket, and then he walked away. I just laid there, too hurt to move, and when I finally sat up, my coat was torn and my face was bleeding. My bag of gifts was on the ground, so I picked it up, and the lot where the man had been sitting was empty now, and I didn't know where he went. I just walked home slowly, and every step hurt. The streets didn't look as cheerful anymore, and the lights and decorations didn't seem bright. I just wanted to get inside and forget what happened. When I got home, I sat by my window and looked outside, and there was snow falling. My body hurt, but I felt a lot worse on the inside. I kept thinking about the man and the look on his face. He didn't just seem angry. There was something else, something I didn't understand. The next morning was Christmas, and I opened the gifts that I had bought for myself, but it didn't make me happy. All I could think about was that guy, and I wondered why he got so angry and why he attacked me, and I just couldn't figure it out. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy, and I kept looking out the window, but there was nothing there. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and I didn't know if I would ever feel normal again. It was a Monday, exactly 1 week before Christmas, when I arrived home from work to find a package on my family's front porch. I was in my final year of high school, and I'd landed myself a holiday job so I could buy gifts. But since I was on the early shift and finished around 2 or 2:30, I used to get home way earlier than my mom and dad when it was still light outside. It was addressed to my dad, around the size of a shoebox, and had "Handle with care" written on the plain brown wrapping paper. It didn't look like a Christmas gift, but since it was that time of the year, I figured that's what it was. I carefully picked it up and immediately noticed that it felt much heavier than it looked. I remember thinking, okay, whatever's inside must have been expensive, because the weight of it, coupled with the "Handle with care" thing, that made me think that it was some dishware, maybe even a car stereo, the kind of thing that he was into. Carefully, I set it down on the kitchen table, trying to figure out who it might be from. My dad didn't have many friends, and he spent most of his time at work, so I figured it was either from a client or someone from his small circle of friends. I didn't put too much thought into it, though, because all would be revealed come Christmas when he opened it. At least, that's what I thought. Mom came home a few hours later, then Dad was the last to get home at around 6 that evening. We showed him the package the second that he'd stepped in the kitchen, then after making coffee and asking us about our days, Dad took the package up to his office. Mom told him that he should wait till Christmas before opening it, but Dad was right when he said nothing on the package marked it out as a gift, and the wrapping paper was plain and there wasn't any sort of Merry Christmas written on the tag. The only distinctive marking it had was my dad's name, so he figured it was something to do with work and wouldn't be particularly exciting. The last thing my mom said to him was something like, "Well, if it's edible, at least share some with us." And he said he would, and then he walked out of the kitchen. Seconds after my dad carried the package up to his office, I finished my coffee, put the cup in the sink, and then walked into the family room and flopped down on the couch in front of the TV. I was flicking through the channels when I called out to my mom asking what time dinner was going to be ready. I didn't get to finish that sentence, though. I was midway through when we both heard this very tremendous bang coming from upstairs, and we met each other in the hallway. Mom and myself, I mean, and then ran upstairs to see what the hell made that noise. Mom made it to the door of my dad's office first, and when she opened it, I didn't see what was inside. I just sort of smelled this burning of chemicals before Mom started to scream. And what happened next was kind of a blur. I remember looking into the office and seeing my father, but then immediately slamming the door closed again because he wasn't him anymore. It was a complete mess in there. Pieces of him were everywhere, and I knew he was dead. There was no bringing him back, and there was so much blood and bits of body everywhere that my gut reaction was to just not want to see him. My priority was Mom, and it kind of amazes me how I figured all that out in a fraction of a second, totally wordlessly. She saw what she saw and screamed, like you might expect any regular person to do when they see their life partner blown apart in front of them. But with me, it was like a shutdown. Emotionally, I mean, so I could deal with the fact that my mom was having a complete nervous breakdown right before my eyes. I mean, given what she'd seen, what we'd just seen, there was no telling what she was going to do. The only thing I could get her to focus on was calling 911, so that's what we did. But then, she told the 911 operator what had happened, and then that sent her into a spiral again. She wailed and cried and passed the phone over to me, and I had to leave the room just to be able to focus on what was coming out of my mouth. It was terrible. Without a doubt, the single worst thing I've ever experienced, and I know for a fact that I'll never get over it. But that's not because it was so sudden or violent. It's because even all these years later, we have no idea who sent that package or why. The only clue I got is how people at his job acted in the time after his funeral. Dad worked for some import or export company that operated out of Los Angeles and San Diego. He made them a lot of money, and he was paid handsomely for his services. The company was amazing in the initial aftermath of his death. They paid all of his funeral costs, made sure the life insurance and pension money came through, and even offered to pay for me and my mom to head off on a vacation to Hawaii for about a month, though we didn't accept that offer. And when it came time for me to try and find out what Dad actually did for them, as in what his job was, they completely shut down and started stonewalling us. They basically said that they were more than happy to assist with any further financial costs in relation to Dad's murder, but when it came time to finding out so much as a scrap of information about how he actually made them their money, that was against company policy. They promised that they'd worked hand in hand with the cops should they reach out to talk to them. But then, according to those very same cops, the company only did the bare minimum that they were legally required to do, and then their lips were sealed. As one cop put it, they went out of their way to ensure that we only had a vague job title and description in the form of product acquisition, and very little else. We didn't know what his day-to-day looked like. We didn't know the names of the people he worked with, and when it came to the possibility of Dad making any enemies through his job, his bosses and coworkers were less than helpful. It made no sense to us at the time. How could they be so helpful and not get in trouble with the law for, I don't know, obstruction of justice or something like that? Well, they had lawyers, a lot of them, who helped them stay well within the legal guidelines, while at the same time keeping us and the cops almost completely in the dark. We had no idea who had sent that bomb, no idea why they'd wanted to kill my father, and no idea how the hell they'd managed to make the whole thing completely untraceable. The only thing the cops could think of was that whoever built that bomb and delivered it to our house had been hired as a professional to do a job. In other words, my dad was killed by a corporate hitman. They never found the guy that did it, and we never found if anyone paid to have him killed, and if so, who. The pain has gotten easier over the years, and Mom definitely still struggles with it from time to time, but in terms of being able to function as a family, things have gotten a lot better. The only thing I've struggled with is the resentment that I feel towards the people he worked with, the people who abandoned us when we needed them most, and the people I'm pretty sure have intimate knowledge of the circumstances in which my dad was murdered. I've had 2 different therapists tell me that, if I let it, my resentment will be the thing that destroys me. But I disagree. I think the only people who will really suffer if I let that happen are the people who know what happened to my dad. Ireland is my home, and I love it here. But there's no denying it's a very strange place with a very violent past. We love a good ghost story here, and I think half the pubs and churches in County Offaly are supposed to be haunted. But I've got a little theory regarding our affinity with the macabre. You see, when your lush green Emerald Isle is thus because it's been watered with the blood of countless conflicts, a daft old story about some wailing apparition is considered entertainment. The story I've got for you today isn't one of ghouls, ghosts, or goblins. It's something that actually took place in a little village named Kilmula. In Old Gaelic, Kilmula means the forested hill, which isn't a very creative name for a place that sits on a hill with a load of trees on it, but it was there for hundreds upon hundreds of years, before a slow, steady decline saw it abandoned and derelict. Being right on the border between Great Britain and Free Ireland, the area around Kilmula became a hotspot for cross-border arms smuggling from the 60s onwards. At any one time, the place was either crawling with police, British Army, or the IRA, which was naturally a lot of bother for the folks living there. And so by the early 90s, the place was a ghost town. I know all that because my granddad grew up in Kilmula, and I thought that he'd be sad to see his childhood home a crumbling ruin that doesn't even appear on maps after about 2010. But he once told me that Kilmula becoming a derelict was the best thing to ever happen to it. He said it was a terrible place where terrible things happened, and he was glad his family moved away when they did. I was in my late 20s when he told me that, and it stunned the rest of my family as much as it did me. We'd always assumed that he'd had quite a happy childhood, but it turned out our granddad had never really talked about growing up in Kilmula. He'd mentioned old school friends here and there. He'd often spoken of his family too, but he'd stayed relatively quiet about his place of birth. So much so that when he did finally tell us about it, we could barely believe our ears. According to Granddad, Kilmula was, for want of a better word, cursed. He was deadly serious when he said it was a place where terrible things happened, and nearly one Christmas evening, once we'd all settled after dinner, he told us a story that I'll never forget. According to Granddad, Kilmula had been the site of many a massacre, even before 3/4 of the village was slaughtered by Cromwell's army back in the 17th century. But it was the events following Kilmula's reconstruction that gave the village its reputation. There were all kinds of strange deaths and disappearances. People went mad or developed strange illnesses. But without a shadow of a doubt, the worst thing that happened during Grandpa's childhood happened during Joseph Flaherty's Christmas shindig. The Flaherty family owned a small farm on the opposite side of the River Blackwater, and on it they had a farmhouse, a few fields, and a whiskey distillery. They weren't exactly a wealthy family by any stretch of the imagination, but they had a few friends and employees, and they'd like to throw a little shindig every Christmas to say thank you for everyone's love and hard work. As you can imagine, the presence of a distillery on the land made the Flaherty's shindigs very popular affairs, and none were so popular as their Christmas get-together. Year after year, they threw the best party in the whole of County Monaghan, until one year in the early 30s, when the Flaherty family threw their final shindig. As November rolled over into December, and festive feeling began to spread among the townsfolk, people began to look forward to the annual Christmas shindig. But then, one night, someone pinned a note to the Flaherty's door, and roughly speaking, this is what it said: "Your irreverence for the holy season has gone on long enough. Proceed, and there will be consequences." The note was evidently referring to the Christmas shindig, which, given the abundance of whiskey on the premises, were always rowdy affairs where music was played long into the night. But the note wasn't signed, and nor did they specify what those consequences might be. Furious inquiries were made, with the family patriarch Joseph demanding to know who'd pinned the note to their door. He asked almost everybody in Kilmola face to face, demanding each of them to swear they knew nothing of the note or its author. Most people were horrified and told Joseph that not only had it not been them that left the note, but he'd be the first person they told if they found out. Convinced it was merely a lone killjoy hoping to ruin his fun, old Joe Flaherty went ahead with planning his shindig. In fact, one might say in typical Irish fashion, he redoubled his efforts as a show of defiance. He organized for a full band to travel down from Monaghan town, promised a festive feast that outdid anything that had come before, and according to Grandad, was even rumored to have purchased a few bottles of the finest French champagne from a purveyor in Dublin. As the weeks went by, and the date of the shindig approached, Grandad remembered people getting more and more excited with each passing day. People had to work very hard back then to maintain what little they had, so the idea of being able to let their hair down and dance away their worries was obviously of massive appeal, and it appealed to a hell of a lot of people too. Usually the Flaherty family extended invitations to friends, families, and employees, but that year they told their employees to bring their friends and their friends' friends and just about anyone who'd fancied a good old-fashioned piss-up. And then before long, half of County Monaghan was expecting the night of their lives in the old Flaherty house, but not Grandad. He said the Flaherty's Christmas shindigs were no place for a child. And with all that drink and all those unmarried young people, it was safe to say that some very ungodly things occurred at those shindigs. But that's exactly why my granddad's older brother, so my great-uncle, was so excited to attend. He'd had his eye on a girl from the next town over, Molly or Holly or whatever, and having heard that she was planning on attending, he was dead set on going himself to try and court her. But as it turns out, going to that shindig was the biggest mistake he ever made. And so on the night of the party, all the attendees head off in their finest clothes and dancing shoes, all intending on having the night of their lives. Some weren't expected home until the wee small hours of the morning, and others not until the following day. So at first their unexpected absences were met with nothing but assumptions of a grand old hootenanny. County Monaghan's wives and mothers weren't best pleased, that much is true, and Grandad remembers his mum getting in a right old nark that my brother failed to come home. But after the morning and afternoon passed with no sign whatsoever of any returning partygoers, people began to worry. When it became evident that not a single person that had been to that party had returned home, a group of the older and more responsible menfolk walked all the way over to Flaherty Farm to see what the crack was. Apparently, they knew something was wrong from how quiet the place was as they approached, but it was only once they were inside that they saw how terrible things truly were. That winter had been an exceptionally cold one, and the weather had been equally grim on the night of the Christmas shindig. So instead of heading home when suitably sauced, the partygoers saw fit to sleep wherever they could find a spot. People slept on couches and armchairs, on the floor, on the table, anywhere they could find a space, and they nestled into their dreamless, boozy slumbers. And for most of them, the places they chose to sleep were the places they died. At some point, we suspect very early in the morning, a group of men approached the Flaherty farm and quietly made their way into the farmhouse. There, almost 30 people slept in the home's many rooms, many of them in a deep and dreamless sleep from all the whiskey they'd guzzled down the night before. Then after, quietly creeping among the sleeping revelers, the interlopers began to silently slaughter them. One by one, they sliced into their throats or drove their knives into their hearts, working quickly, quietly, and with devastating effect. When people started to wake up here and there, they were set upon to silence their screams. Then when the killers lost control of the situation, they produced pistols and opened fire. We know all this because the police examined the scene sometime afterwards and were quite easily able to determine who had been killed in their sleep with a blade versus who had been shot while trying to escape or fight back. We also know the killers once again pinned a note to the Flaherty's door. "We warn them," was all it read. Granddad said that almost every family in County Monaghan lost a loved one on that morning, and what followed became known as the Black Christmas of 1943. What should have been a season of joy and goodwill became a season of mourning and funerals, and an awful lot of police officers had to work over Christmas when they'd otherwise thought they'd be free to enjoy their goose and their Christmas pudding with family. And the people who committed the act of mass murder were never found. The police believed they'd found the boot prints of 3 men leading off in the direction of the nearby river, but it's there that the trail ran cold, quite literally, as the river was so cold it was close to freezing over. The police suspected the killers had waded down the river in order to avoid leaving tracks, as it was too shallow in many parts to effectively row a boat. But to a person, it's not exactly ankle deep either. Whoever killed all those people were content to wade through a freezing cold river, possibly for miles, in order to properly cover their tracks. Granddad said that made some people think the killers were not human, but to me, that just shows how psychopathically determined they were to avoid punishment. The police searched high and low for them, questioned every priest in County Monaghan to see if they knew anyone who might be capable of such a thing, but not a soul could help them. My great-uncle had been one of those murdered at the party, supposedly being one of the last to die while trying to fight back against his killers. Granddad said that gave him consolation, but their mother was distraught. He could have died in his sleep, at peace and unaware, but instead, her son died terrified at the hands of killers who never saw justice for their crimes. The grief of losing their son was partly why the family moved away to begin with, but like Granddad said, there was other stuff going on around Kilmoola that he called unnatural. He died before telling us any more detailed stories about the bad things which happened to his old hometown, which, to me, both is and isn't a shame. I'd have loved to have learned more about it, but at the same time, I'm glad he didn't have to go picking at old wounds. On Christmas Eve of 1985, the surreal town of Ethel, Washington was abuzz with festive spirit. Christmas lights adorned houses and carolers filled the streets with songs of joy. Yet amidst the Yuletide cheer, a sinister act shattered the peace, leaving an indelible scar on the small community. The brutal murders of Ed and Minnie Morin, an elderly couple known for their kindness and warmth, remains one of the most harrowing crimes in the region's history. 81-year-old Ed Morin and his wife of 83 years old, Minnie, were lifelong residents of Lewis County, Washington. Married for over half a century, they were pillars of their community, admired for their unwavering dedication to their family and church. Despite their advanced age, The Morans were independent and active, spending their days tending to their farm and participating in local events. To their neighbors and friends, the Morans seemed to have everything: a happy marriage, a loving family, and a peaceful life in rural America. No one could have imagined the terror that awaited them just one day before Christmas. On the morning of December 19th, 1985, the Morans' routine took a puzzling turn. Family members who visited their home noticed something strange. The couple's car, a green 1969 Chrysler Newport, was missing. Their home appeared undisturbed, yet Ed and Minnie were nowhere to be found. A mysterious phone message left for their son suggested that something was amiss, but the message revealed no clear signs of danger. When their family tried calling, there was no answer. Neighbors reported seeing the couple earlier that morning, but their whereabouts after leaving home were unknown. Alarmed, the family contacted the Lewis County Sheriff's Office, initiating what would become an exhaustive search. The search for the Morans ended in tragedy on Christmas Eve. Their bodies were discovered in a remote wooded area near Adna, about 15 miles from their home. Both Ed and Minnie had been shot, execution style, in the back. The scene painted a grim picture. The elderly couple had been forced to kneel before being killed in cold blood. Investigators concluded that the Morans had been abducted from their home. Evidence suggested that they were coerced into withdrawing $8,500 from their bank account at a nearby branch earlier that day. The missing Chrysler was later found abandoned in a supermarket parking lot, its interior stained with blood. News of the murder sent shockwaves through Lewis County. Ethel, a close-knit community, struggled to come to terms with the violent crime. Vigils were held to honor the Morans, and locals came together to support the grieving family. The thought of such brutality inflicted upon two beloved community members was unfathomable. "They were the kindest people you could ever meet," said one neighbor. "It's hard to believe anyone could harm them." Despite the outpouring of community support, the investigation faced significant challenges. Leads were scarce and the crime scene yielded few clues. Witnesses recalled seeing the Morans' car on the day of their disappearance, but descriptions of the individuals involved were inconsistent. The lack of surveillance technology in the 1980s further hampered efforts to identify the culprits. Detectives theorized that the murders were financially motivated. The forced withdrawal of $8,500 indicated that the perpetrators saw the Morans as an easy target. However, the brutality of the crime suggested a level of malice that went beyond mere greed. Over the years, the case grew cold, and despite their best efforts, law enforcement was unable to identify any suspects. The Morans' family continued to advocate for justice, refusing to let the memory of Ed and Minnie fade away. And eventually in 2012, nearly 3 decades after the murders, the case took a dramatic turn. Advances in forensic technology and renewed investigative efforts led to the arrest of Rick Rife, a former resident of Lewis County who had long been suspected of involvement. Rife and his now deceased brother John Rife were believed to have targeted the Morans for their perceived wealth. The breakthrough came after witnesses came forward with new information, corroborating earlier suspicions about the Rife brothers' involvement. Additionally, investigators uncovered evidence linking Rick Rife to the crime, including testimony from individuals who had heard him boast about the murders. Rick Rife's trial in 2013 captivated the community. Prosecutors argued that Rife and his brother had abducted the Morans, forced them to withdraw money, and then executed them to eliminate witnesses. They presented testimony from over 100 witnesses, painting a chilling portrait of the events leading up to the murders. Rife's defense maintained his innocence, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that the case relied heavily on witness testimony from decades prior. However, the jury found the prosecution's case compelling, and after weeks of deliberation, Rick Rife was convicted of first-degree murder, robbery, kidnapping, and burglary, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Moran family, Rick Rife's conviction brought a sense of closure, but not peace. "It doesn't bring them back," said one family member. but at least we know who did this and they're being held accountable. The case remains a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly idyllic communities. And to this day, the murders of Ed and Minnie Morin served as a cautionary tale of the fragility of safety and the resilience of those left behind. Nearly 40 years after their tragic deaths, Eddie and Minnie Morin are remembered not for the horror they endured, but for the lives they lived. Their legacy endures through their family and the community that contributes to honor their memory. Each Christmas, a wreath is laid at their gravesite, a symbol of the love and respect they inspired. While the wounds of their loss may never fully heal, the Morin story underscores the importance of seeking justice, no matter how long it takes. Their lives, though cruelly cut short, remain a testament to the power of kindness and the enduring strength of a community united in the face of tragedy. On Christmas Eve of 2011, the festive spirit of Nashville, Tennessee was suddenly and violently shattered by the brutal murder of Paul Logan, a 55-year-old businessman known for his generosity and kindness of spirit. And what began as a celebration of the season turned into a chilling tale of deceit, betrayal, and a tangled web of relationships that ultimately led to his untimely death. This story delves into the life and tragic end of Paul Logan and the investigation that uncovered the truth behind his murder. Paul Logan was a very popular and highly respected figure within the Nashville community, and as the owner of a successful real estate company, he'd earned himself a vast fortune through the sale of local properties. He had a reputation as a hard worker and a big spender, but Paul has also built a reputation for helping those in need. Friends and family described him as a man of integrity, someone who would regularly go out of his way to assist others. He lived alone in a modest yet well-appointed home in the suburbs of Nashville, where he often hosted holiday gatherings for friends and colleagues. On December 24th of 2011, Paul had plans to attend a Christmas Eve service at his local church, followed by a dinner with close friends. When he failed to show up, concern quickly grew. Calls to his phone went unanswered, and then by Christmas morning, when he still failed to answer calls, his friends decided to check on him. What they discovered would haunt them forever. Paul Logan was found dead in his living room, lying in a pool of blood. He had been stabbed multiple times and signs of a violent struggle were evident. Furniture was overturned and a shattered lamp lay nearby. The Christmas tree, once a symbol of holiday cheer, stood askew, its decorations scattered across the floor. The scene painted a grim picture of Paul's final moments. Investigators were called to the scene, and it was immediately clear that this was no random act of violence. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Paul either knew his killer or had willingly allowed them into his home. Detectives began piecing together Paul's final hours, interviewing friends, neighbors, and colleagues. One of the first breakthroughs came from a neighbor who reported seeing an unfamiliar car parked outside Paul's home late on Christmas Eve. The description of the vehicle, a dark sedan, would later prove crucial. As investigators delved into Paul's personal life, they uncovered a complex web of relationships. While Paul was generally well-liked, he had recently been involved in a business dispute with a former associate, Eric Matthews. The two had parted ways acrimoniously after a failed real estate deal, and Matthews had reportedly made threats against Paul. This immediately placed him on the radar of the police. As the investigation continued, forensic evidence from the crime scene provided a major lead. A blood-stained knife, believed to be the murder weapon, was found discarded in a trash can a few blocks from Paul's home. DNA analysis revealed two profiles, Paul's and an unknown individual. At the same time, surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses were reviewed. A camera from a neighbor's driveway captured a dark sedan matching the witness's description, leaving Paul's home around the time of the murder. The vehicle was traced back to Eric Matthews, whose alibi quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Eric Matthews, a 42-year-old real estate agent, was known for his volatile temper and history of financial troubles. Investigators discovered that Matthews had been struggling to repay a substantial debt to Paul, which had strained their relationship. Further digging revealed text messages and emails in which Matthews expressed anger and resentment toward Paul, accusing him of ruining his career. When confronted with the evidence, Matthews initially denied any involvement. However, inconsistencies in his story combined with the mounting forensic evidence eventually led to his arrest. During a search of his home, investigators found clothes with traces of Paul's blood, as well as documents indicating his financial desperation. The trial of Eric Matthews began in the fall of 2012 and attracted significant media attention. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man driven by greed and anger, who saw Paul Logan as an obstacle to his success. They argued that Matthews had gone to Paul's home on Christmas Eve under the pretense of reconciliation, only to attack him in a fit of rage when Paul refused to forgive his debts. The defense, however, attempted to cast doubt on the evidence, suggesting that it was circumstantial and that other individuals with motives had not been thoroughly investigated. They also highlighted Matthews' lack of a prior violent history, arguing that it was out of character for him to commit such a heinous act. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Eric Matthews guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a sense of closure to Paul's family and friends, though the pain of his loss would linger for years to come. Paul Logan's murder serves as a sobering reminder of how easily trust can be betrayed, and how the holiday season, a time of joy for many, can also be marred by tragedy. In the wake of his death, Paul's friends and colleagues established a charitable foundation in his name, dedicated to providing housing assistance to those in need. A fitting tribute to a man who devoted his life to helping others. The murder of Paul Logan is a stark example of how personal and financial pressures can spiral out of control, leading to devastating consequences. It's a story that underscores the importance of vigilance, even among those we consider friends and colleagues, and the enduring impact of violence on a community. And though justice was served, the memory of Paul Logan continues to inspire acts of kindness and generosity in Nashville and beyond. His legacy reminds us that, even in the darkest of times, the spirit of compassion and giving can prevail. On a crisp December morning in 1996, the peaceful calm of Alexandria, Virginia, was shattered by a chilling discovery. In a small, serene cemetery nestled between the headstones lay the lifeless body of an unidentified woman. She appeared to have passed peacefully, yet the circumstances surrounding her death were anything but ordinary. Beside her, an artificial Christmas tree stood as a silent sentinel, a poignant symbol of the holiday season. To this day, she is remembered as the Christmas Tree Lady. It was December 18th of 1996 when a groundskeeper at the Pleasant Valley Memorial Park in Alexandria came upon the body. She was reclining on a plastic sheet, her head resting on a clear bag filled with shredded green and white Christmas tinsel. Her attire was unremarkable: a blue trench coat, a sweater, and slacks, all neatly arranged. Beside her lay an assortment of peculiar items: a portable cassette player with 2 tapes, a few empty juice bottles, and a small artificial Christmas tree adorned with golden ribbons. Yet the most striking detail was the absence of any outward signs of violence. Authorities would later conclude that the circumstances of her death were a mystery, but that she had been killed using a combination of alcohol and antihistamines. However, this conclusion did little to explain the killer's motivations or the identity of their victim. The Christmas Tree Lady was estimated to be between 50 and 70 years of age. She had graying auburn hair and wore glasses. Her clothing, while unassuming, was clean and suggested a middle-class background. She carried no identification, and her fingerprints were not in any database, leaving investigators with few clues as to who she was. A note was found among her belongings: cryptic in its content but revealing her intent. It read, "Deceased. Prefer no autopsy. Please order cremation with funds provided. Thank you. Jane Doe." Attached to the note was a $50 bill, presumably intended to cover the costs of her cremation. The bizarre request for anonymity, even in death, was chilling, leaving investigators and the public alike to wonder who murdered her and why. The lack of identification and the meticulously planned nature of her death fueled speculation. Why had her killer chosen this particular cemetery? Why had they brought an artificial Christmas tree? And was there a deeper significance to the holiday season in her decision? Some theorized that the victim was a widow, or someone who had recently suffered a personal tragedy. Some speculated that the cemetery itself might hold a connection to a loved one she'd lost, yet searches of the burial records revealed no obvious links. Others suggested that she might have been homeless or estranged from her family, yet her clean and well-maintained appearance seemed to contradict this theory. The presence of the artificial Christmas tree is perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the case. It seemed deliberately placed, standing as a stark reminder of the season of joy and togetherness. Some have speculated that the tree was a symbolic gesture, representing a longing for connection during a time of year when loneliness can be particularly acute. Others believe it was an attempt to mock the very nature of the holiday season. Authorities pursued every lead they could find, though there were precious few. Local and national databases yielded no matches for her fingerprints. Her dental records provided no answers. Investigators released sketches and details of the case to the public, hoping someone might recognize her, but no one came forward. The cassette tapes found at the scene contained recordings of classical and religious music, further deepening the sense of mystery. Nearly 3 decades later, the identity of the Christmas tree lady remains unknown. Her story has become a poignant reminder of the hidden struggles many face, particularly during the holidays, when the lonely and vulnerable can be isolated and targeted during the coldest and darkest times of the year. True crime enthusiasts and amateur sleuths have kept their memory alive, discussing her case in forums and podcasts. Advances in forensic technology such as genetic genealogy offer hope that one day her identity might be uncovered. Until then, the Christmas tree lady stands as a haunting symbol of an unsolved mystery, her story etched into the annals of true crime lore. The years since her death, the Christmas tree lady has touched the hearts of many who have learned of her story. As investigators and the public continue to ponder her identity and the meaning behind her final acts, her legacy endures, wrapped in the enduring mystery of a story untold. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, switching to water can save you 750 calories a day.